The Boston Massacre also led to the formation of the Committees of Correspondence. These provided leadership and communication networks among the colonists at the town and colony level. They warned each other about British actions and planned colonial resistance to these actions. And here you see one of the main methods of doing this is by a writer sending a message from town to town. An important early member of the Committees of Correspondence was Samuel Adams. Adams hated British taxation and helped form a group called the Sons of Liberty. This was a secret society formed to protect the rights of the colonists and took actions against the abuses of the British government. In 1773, the British government passed the Tea Act. It gave the British East India Company permission to sell tea directly to the colonies. It actually made tea cheaper to the colonists. Because of this, the British did not think the colonists would complain. So what the Tea Act does, places the tax on tea, which is the most popular drink in the colonies. Many colonists viewed the act as yet another example of taxation tyranny, which is cruel, unreasonable, or arbitrary use of power or control. This is because it left an earlier duty on tea entering the colonies in place, while removing the duty on tea entering England. So they still had to pay a tax. It caused the colonists to worry about the British government eventually trying to control other trades. So the tea tax went against the colonial philosophy of no taxation without representation. The dislike of the Tea Act led to an event which changed the relationship between England and the colonies forever. In December 1773, demonstrators, led by the Sons of Liberty, disguised as Indians, destroyed an entire shipment of tea by throwing it into the Boston harbor. This was an act of civil disobedience in defiance of the Tea Act. It became known as the Boston Tea Party. So to show their dislike of the tea tax, the Sons of Liberty dressed up as Indians and destroyed the tea in the Boston harbor. England was outraged. This was no longer about taxes. It was about England's control over the colonies. In response to the Boston Tea Party, Britain passed the Coercive Acts in 1774. The colonists called them the Intolerable Acts. Intolerable means too harsh or cruel. That's how the colonists felt about these acts. So again, in response to the Tea Party, England passed the Intolerable Acts, and to the colonists, these acts were just mean. England saw the destruction of 342 chests of tea as willful destruction of private property. Someone had to pay. Boston Harbor was closed to trade until the tea was paid for. Only food and firewood were permitted into the port. Town meetings were banned and the authority of the royal governor was increased. So what the Intolerable Acts does is it closes the port of Boston down. To add insult to injury, General Gage, the British commander of North American forces, was appointed governor of Massachusetts. British troops and officials would now be tried in England for crimes of murder, and more soldiers were sent to Boston. So what that meant, if something like the Boston Massacre happened again, these British soldiers would not be tried in the colonies, but they would be sent back to England to be put on trial, which means they would probably be found not guilty. As part of the Coercive Acts, the Quartering Act was enacted. Colonists had to quarter, which means house, British soldiers at their own expense. So here you see a picture of the British soldiers making their way into the homes of the colonists, which they could stay in, and the colonists had to pay for it. Instead of backing down, all of the colonies began to support Massachusetts. Colonies like Virginia stated that an attack on one colony was the same as an attack on all the colonies. Patrick Henry urged colonists to start thinking themselves as one people. And in this case, that one people would be Americans. The First Continental Congress agreed to boycott British products. They also told the colonies to have their militias, which are citizens' armies, to start preparing for war. They also decided that if the boycott did not work, they would meet again in May of 1775. It was now a waiting game. So the only army the colonies had was the militias, which were nothing more than citizens' soldiers. But in April 1775, colonial militias and British troops fought at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, starting the American Revolution. So when the revolution breaks out, you have the citizens' armies of the colonies versus the professional army of Great Britain.